When's the signal on?
Action, Kenny.
Okay. We've been talking about baseball and fundamentals and all those things like that, and I can't help but think at one time in Pittsburgh they had Little League Day, and there were 7,000 youngsters out on the field in their uniforms, and I'm sitting on the bench with Gene Freeze, and I looked out there and it looked like a giant kaleidoscope, and I said, "Gene, doesn't that look great?" And he looked at me and he said, "Do you realize every one of those little buzzards wants our job?" All of a sudden I looked at it from a different perspective. But later, we wound up for over 35 years teaching baseball camps to youngsters. And as we reflected back on how we were fundamentally taught from the time we were youngsters, that was the emphasis of what we did in the baseball camps, which we did in Oliver, British Columbia, Sun Valley, all around Seattle. And over the course of those 35 years, we taught 14,000 youngsters the fundamentals of baseball, and we were very proud of that accomplishment. But there was one thing that happened one time that kind of shows you in Ed's mind how we share things. We were coming back from Oliver, British Columbia, and Ed, who lead foot is not really a proper word for what he does with the pedal and the gas in the car. He's zipping along at a tidy 92 miles an hour when behind us comes this, "Ah!" And Ed looked at me and he said, "What do you think we ought to do?" And I said, "Well, the first thing is you should hand me that beer you're drinking so I can throw it out the window," which I was successfully able to accomplish. The policeman called on the door and he said, "It wasn't me that got you." He says, "It was the helicopter." He said, "You're going 92 and a 70. He says, "I got to write you up." He said, "Let me see your ticket, your deal." So Ed, he says, "O'Brien." He says, "You don't, Seattle, you don't happen to have a brother Jim that's in the sheriff's department over here?" And Ed beamed and he says, "Yes, that's our younger brother." So he had the big smile, and the cop said, "Well," he said, "I'll be back." He came back and he says, I can't do much for you because the helicopter got you." He said, "But what I can do," he says, "I'll put 78 and a 70. And he said, "That'll save you about $250 on the deal." Ed says, "Well, that's fine. Oh, sure, I thank you." And he said, "Oh, Ed," he says, "I got one piece of advice for you." And Ed says, "What's that?" He says, "Keep driving slow. We got another speed trap on the other side of town." And he said, "And say hello to Jim." And so off we go. And the ticket was $68. So Ed says, "This ain't bad, $34 a piece." I said, "What?" He said, "Oh yeah, we always split the first ticket." Well, anyway, that only cost me $34, so I was pretty happy, I guess, about that. But Ed is going to continue with some other things right
I
now.
have one question. How much of that $250 did your brother see?
Oh. Good one, Kenny.
I don't think he knows to this day that happened, and I'm really mad at you for bringing it up.
I've written down a little potpourri of things we want to touch on. But at first Jim brought some beautiful stuff, family stuff. For example, when we were in service, here's a picture of John, Jim, myself, the chief, and Billy. And Teresa took the picture.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Of course.
You know how we talked about grandfather Mike and how mean he was and how tough he was. And we talked a lot about the chief and how tough he was. And I want to tell you something. I want to show you this. And this is the strength of him and why we didn't mess around when the chief said something to do. That was the chief in his hellion days, man. He was a tough bird. Okay, Ed, you can continue.
We're in New York at a Commodore Hotel, and Jim comes up. And Jim a lot of times would go watch the Yankees play rather than watch us, and then we'd go out to dinner after. So John comes up with a beauty. John says, I got a good deal going. He says, I've got, with Roberto Clemente. He said, Roberto speaks very broken English and not very much of it, so he says, I'm helping him with his English, and he's teaching me Spanish. And Jim says, you are an idiot. He says, you teach him English, have him teach you how to hit. We, there were also little special things that come up here. I wrote down a note here. I wrote the name Joe Rothschild. He was a banker, upstate New York, a very wealthy guy. And he used to play bridge with Gorin, who's, all of you know who Gorin is. So what he did one spring training, he would take 3 guys out to dinner. He came down to Florida. And then he'd take us over to his apartment and teach us bridge. So this baseball team, although they weren't winning games, they all knew how to play bridge. And we had a good time with it during the season. I want to look on here to make sure I don't miss anything. Well, this is something that happened. I was shipped one year to the International League, and that stretched from Montreal to Havana, Cuba. And when I joined the team, we were about to go over to Cuba, and when we opened our mailboxes, there was a note in there. Do not come to Cuba, we are going to kill you. And this was the revolutionaries that were over there. So we all thought we'd skip this trip, and the next thing you know, we're on a plane to Cuba. So we get in there, and as we got in there, we head to the hotel. Now we're looking for bullets coming from anywhere. And get in the hotel, get settled on. So we're playing a game that night. And the games in Cuba started at 8 o'clock because it was so hot over there. And I'm the leadoff hitter. So I go out. And one thing they forgot to tell me was that at 8 o'clock in Havana, Cuba, they shoot a cannon off out into the water. I am now standing at home plate with they're playing the Cuban national anthem in the United States. My bat in hand, my hand over heart, and that cannon goes off. The only thing left at the plate was my bat. I darted to the dugout, and the most embarrassing moment in my history was coming back out to get my bat to start the game. I don't tell that one. That's an inside one now. Don't get that one spread around.
Incidentally, that league stretched from Havana, Cuba to Montreal. And in 1958, I was with the Rochester Red Wings for a bit. And we went into Montreal and we played a 13-inning game. And Tom Lasorda was the pitcher for Montreal. And Bob Gibson was the pitcher for us. And you talk about night and day. Lasorda couldn't break that pane of glass from 5 feet away. Gibson would throw the ball right through it. And the thing that always amazed me, and I told Lasorda this when I saw him, at the end of 8 innings, Lasorda was out of gas. And if Gibson pitched the whole 13 innings and was throwing bullets at the end of 13. But in those days, man, it was 100 degrees the day before in Havana, Cuba, and that night it was 38 degrees in Montreal when we played. Go ahead, Ed.
Also, in that league, I played shortstop for Columbus until they made a pitcher out of me. But we played 56 consecutive days without a day off. And traveling. We would travel from Havana, Cuba to Miami, Miami up to Washington, D.C., D.C. to Columbus, arrive at 6 o'clock, and at 8 o'clock we'd be playing the game. It's a little different than, they even have in their contract today, they have to have a day off after so many days they play. But, you know, there was a fun part to it. You're doing something you really like. You know, you're playing ball, and then you get a check every 2 weeks, so it really worked out nicely for us. Now I'm going to tell you about a portion of what happened to us. We're going to try and keep this whole program here to a half hour and wrap it up. So
It'll never happen.
Well, one of the things I mentioned. Oh, go ahead. What did you want to say?
What?
You were going to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna tell something on a youngster, but I can do that before you do that if you want me to.
I better take it while I got it.
Whatever.
In between all of this, we forgot to mention we spent 21 months in the United States Army. And we knew this was going to happen.
Let me interrupt again. We were at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Emmitsburg, Maryland. And we were on the security force of the Aberdeen Proving Ground. I was a machine gunner, and Ed was my ammo carrier. Well, we never carried any live ammo. So here I am hauling that damn machine gun around, and he's walking next to me looking at the sky. I mean, he always was smarter than me.
I'll tell you about the Army in Aberdeen Proving Ground. We were going to have an exercise in how to operate in the snow.
Operation Blizzard. It was
Yeah, called Operation Blizzard. It got canceled because it snowed.
Yeah, we went.
And you wonder, well, how the hell did we win a war?
Oh yeah, that was it. That was it.
Well, when we first signed with Pittsburgh, we were in the New Jersey Draft Board. They called us in and they said, look at this. And they had a pile of letters about that high from mothers saying what were we doing, using our bonus money to stay out of the Army while their son was being called in. So they had agreed to let us finish out the season, but they said they couldn't do it now, and they took us in. It was just 2 weeks left in the season. We go into the service. So we go into Newark and get sworn in, and we end up at...
Let me tell you about the physical. They take us, we gotta have the physical. So they got a cameraman there, and they get the stethoscope out, and they had me put it on Ed's heart, and they take a picture, and then the guy says, you're in. We said, where's the physical?
We never got a physical. So we end up at Fort Dix, and one of the things we wanted to stay there, this was it was either Dix or Kilmer, I can't remember. It was Kilmer was only 8 miles from our hometown, and they want to keep us there for sports. But so they're trying to figure a way, and we're in casual company, we're just waiting for them to decide where we're going to do our basic training. So along comes the post guy and says, hey, they're having a volleyball tournament. Put a volleyball team together and get in a volleyball tournament. Well, we never played volleyball. So we get in it, and they had a guy there, and he was 6'8". 6'6" was the limit for the service. And he's doing everything in the civilian clothes. We win the damn tournament. We're supposed to go to Kansas for the national volleyball tournament in service. We aren't even hardly in. And we had beaten the
An officer's team.
the officers team in the final games. And so we go down there the next night for our practice, and here's the officers team there. And we said, what's going on? They said, well, you've been disqualified. The O'Briens are professional volleyball players.
No, they said professional athletes.
Professional athlete. And there's no such thing as a professional athlete in the service, it's you're in. So they took over, and we ended up getting thrown out of our own tournament that we won. So we go to then they decide they can't get us there, and they call us in. And they said, here's what's going to happen. We want you to play baseball and basketball for our Camp Kilmer or Dix, whichever one it was. But we're not. We don't have. It was Kilmer because Kilmer doesn't have basic training. He says, so what we're going to do, we're going to send you to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. They have no sports on campus, although they have a beautiful gymnasium. They have no sports that they participate in. And then when you get your basic training over, we'll try and get you back here. And if we don't get you back here, they're in the Second Army, we're in the First Army, you don't play against us. So we said, okay, so down we go. We end up at Aberdeen, Maryland, which is a there's a very private part of that base and then a very public part. The private part, I think, deals with chemical warfare. Because I know I had a squad that I took out. We had a drill where you had a squad and you had a compass, And what you would do is you'd take off, and every 10 minutes you'd give the compass to somebody else. Well, I don't know how it happened, but we ended up on the airstrip of the private part of the campus down there. And we were all hauled into jail until they discovered they thought we might have been up to something, but we weren't. Although we couldn't read a compass. So we get assigned to Captain James Smith's Company C. And Smith was a black Sergeant Smith. Great guy, absolute great guy. Treated everybody equal, no favoritism, and so forth. So we're there one day, and Smith says to us, "I understand you guys play basketball." John said, "Yeah, we played a little basketball." He said, "Well, you play for my company team here." So we said, "Okay." So the first night we go down and play against the other companies and so forth, and John gets 53 points. So now Captain Smith's eyes are about as big as this wall in there. So he asked us if we play, and now of course the competition wasn't that tough, so we're just whacking everybody out. And we are assigned to KP. So every other day or every third day you had to do KP, which is kitchen patrol. So we're going down and doing it. And John says, "I got an idea." So it's the third night we're on KP, and at 6 o'clock down comes these two guys. It's Captain Smith. Captain Smith has told us that we're to replace you to finish out your KP, and that'll enable you to go to the basketball game. John says, "No way we're going to the basketball game." John says, "If we're on KP, we're on KP, and we finish it out." So we don't go. The team loses. Next morning, John and I are in Captain Smith's office. He said, O'Brien, he says, "I understand there was a little problem last night." He says, "We'll have to straighten this out." He said, "From now on, you no longer do KP." He said, "I have other job for you." He said, "From now on, you are in charge of the day room." That's where they exercise in the pool, play pool and all that. "You are in charge of the day room from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And I said, "Captain," or Sergeant, I said, "The day room's closed from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. He said, "That's right. I got your message last night. You got mine today." So we ended up shooting pool and all of this stuff, which we couldn't do much with.
But the one thing to keep in mind that when we're in the Army, the Russians never attacked the United States.
And this is when we had that story.
Chinese did.
Yeah, I think they did. This is when we had the two days or the two games in New York City against the Knickerbockers and then against the Lakers. And that was an interesting team. That was George Mikan and that group. Wayne Mickelson, Slater Martin, one of the all-time basketball teams. And New York had a great basketball team. So those were a good series. And you told him about Honey Russell, John, on that?
I'm about to. We were asked to play with the college all-stars. And of course we'd been out playing baseball. We hadn't a ball in our head in months. And they said, "We'll give you the physical training hour each day to get in shape for basketball." So we did that for a week. And they flew us out to Chicago. In the meantime, now we're buck privates. Seeing as we were representing the United States Army, they form-fitted every uniform that we had. We were the best dressed privates in the United States Army. And they flew us to Chicago. We go to the hotel, and the guy at the desk says, "Coach wants to see you up in your room now that you checked in." And we said, "Who's the coach?" And he says, "Honey Russell." Honey Russell was the coach of Seton Hall, who turned us down 4 years earlier, 10 miles from our hometown. So we go up to the room, we knock on the door, and Russell says, "Come in." We open the door, and he says, "You little bastards, I've been getting my butt chewed off in back in the South Orange, Seton Hall for 4 years on account of you two. And Ed quietly said, we still have the telegram where you turned us down. Russell said, burn it, you start both games. And so we had a good time doing that. Played there, played in the Garden the next night, and it was just another kind of topping to the cake of playing sports, that we got the opportunity to play against some of the great teams of all time. What happened there too?
By the NBA?
Pardon me?
Were you drafted by the NBA?
Yes,
Sure.
we were drafted by the the Milwaukee Hawks, who had been the NBA, the St. Louis Hawks. They had Bob Pettit and all those guys. And the owner of the Milwaukee Hawks was a guy named Ben Kerner. And when we went in baseball into Milwaukee to play the Braves, Kerner would have us to lunch, and he wanted Ed and I to play both sports, baseball and basketball. And we never talked money. He even said he would want to take us if we just play home games with them. And before we could get that thing cemented in any way, we got drafted. And then we went in the Army, so that ended that totally. But we were drafted by the NBA. I'll tell you a couple of little things right here about, and I wanted to get this in, about what sports people can do that affect other people. My violin teacher had a wife named Babette, and she did volunteer work up at Swedish Hospital with the youngsters that had leukemia and were terminal. And I got to tell you, I'll tell one in between that. While I was up there working with one kid, there was another youngster in there, and at that time Ed and I were Santa Clauses for the Forgotten Children's Fund, and where we worked for 35 years. And there was a story in the paper that the family of one of these youngsters who were housed a little bit away, someone had broken in their car and stolen all their Christmas presents. So I called, I was the president of them, I called my sister and I said, I'm going to get the Santa Claus suit on, get down there, and we'll load up a bunch of presents for these youngsters because we knew their names. And so we loaded that all up, and I go to this apartment and I ring the bell, and he said, yes. I said, Santa Claus is here. Oh, we'll be right down. So here the four kids come down, and I give them all the presents and all that, and I got the suit on, and the guy says to me, you know, this is a wonderful town. You're the fifth Santa Claus that's been here this morning. So, but anyway, I'm working with this other youngster. His name was Julian Zagars, Z-G-A-R-S. He was from Houston, Texas. His father was a doctor, and his mother was named Sue, if I remember. And he came there. He was 13 years old, but you never know it. He was so emaciated. And he was a great baseball fan. And so Babette asked if I'd come up and talk to him. I said I'd be more than happy to. So I'd go up and we'd talk baseball. And I had this stuff on. He was in the tent, you know. And it went on and on and on. So it became a regular thing. I used to go up every Wednesday. And so his favorite player was Roger Clemens. Well, as it happened, the Clemens and the Boston Red Sox were in the Kingdome on one Wednesday. John McNamara was the manager. So I go to Mac and I say, Mac, give me Clemens for about an hour. I've got to take him up. He said, can't do it, Obe. He's pitching tonight. I said, don't give me that. He's down there in Tunnel A with a rubber suit on that big bike thing, you know. And he said, Obe, he's the hardest working player I've ever seen in my life. He does that every day, including the days he's pitching. I said, oh. I said, well, give me a ball and a picture of Clemens, which he had. So I took it out and I told Roger. Roger signed them both. And I went up to the hospital, and Sue, the mother, was there, and she said, I'm afraid we're going to lose Julian this week. He's down to 60 pounds. He hasn't spoken in a week, and he's getting weaker and weaker by the moment. So I put the stuff on, and I go in there, and he's out there with his eyes closed. And I put the ball through the little hole there, and I said, Julian, Roger Clemens is here in town, and he'd love to come up and see you today, but he's pitching tonight and he can't. So he sent this ball and the picture up for you. He started talking. And he's talking along there, And long story short, a month later, 2 months later, he walked out of that hospital. And he's alive today in Houston, Texas. His mother told me later on he became an Eagle Scout. And we've lost contact now, but they would send us a Christmas card to Gene and I. And that's what the impact of players can have if they do the right things. And I never got the chance to tell Clemens how he saved that little boy's life. And then I'd take him down to the Kingdom, and after the games, when the lights were out, I'd let him go down on the field and let him run the bases. And Alvin Davis and Howard Reynolds were just great. They'd come out and I'd sit with him on the bench, and they'd bring him stuff. And I gave him my Joe DiMaggio ball. When he left to go back to Houston, they needed a separate truck for all the baseball stuff that he had. But, you know, that's some of the nice things that sports eventually give you the opportunity to do. And you just appreciate the fact that people will take that time to do those good things. Edward?
Yeah, you just took my closing argument. I'll tell you, I'll go back to Captain Smith. He calls us in one morning, and he said, got a problem here. He said, you guys are going to have to solve it. He said, Saturday, we were having a softball team all work out when we coached softball for them in the summer. So we coached softball, played basketball for the team, but we had 7 major league players on a post and no baseball team at all. But he said, they're complaining you guys are having fun playing softball, and they're doing, you know, military duties. He said, so what I'd like to do is be fair to everybody in the company. He said, so I'd like to have Saturday practice, the entire company. Every one of them's got to get out there and try and make the softball team. He said, you guys know what to do? We said, yeah, we know what to do. That may have been one of the hardest practices you've ever seen in your life. We ran them, we just wore them right into the ground. Several of them had to be revived. So at the end of the practice, it was a 2-hour practice, we lined them all up again and said, we picked the following for the team. We picked the guys that were on the team already. And the guy said to him, we didn't know softball was this hard. We never had another complaint on that. We had a guy named, little vignettes that come up now and then, Herbie Penoyer. And it reminded me of how things, and he was a friend of one of our other guys there on campus, a fellow, and I can't remember his name, but he is going to, his goal in life, and he's probably still at it, was to see every one of the Indy 500 races. He was from Indianapolis. And had a letter from him back, quite a few years ago now, and he was still on track to do it. But Herbie was the character of the company. And one night, one of the fellows from Alaska invited us over to have dinner with him and see some film he'd shot. And so what it was film of Alaska, and all it was open white spaces. There was nothing there. And this guy is so enthused about these pictures he had taken. And he'd go on, and so we're all sitting in the room. He's got all the lights off. And he's describing this fence. There's a nice fence, a little fence sitting out in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden, Herbie's sitting there and he's going, wow. The next picture up, he'd go, wow. And his wife is just about to kill him. And he'd go, wow. So he did it about 10 times in a row. And he said, I've had enough of this bullshit. And he got up and walked out of the house. And the guy, you know what the guy did? He put the next picture on. But my favorite Army story, we got investigated by the United States Senate while we were on there for preferential treatment to athletics. They named about
KP when it happened.
Yeah, there were about 12 guys that they investigated. They did us, I think, because we did that trip up to play those 2 basketball games. And, well, anyway, we got through basic training, and they called us in again. And they wanted us to be, well, you might as well say CIA guys. They said your MOS is 2204. That's small instrument repair, and we had turned down the CIA type of thing, and so they said, "Here's the deal. You are going to stay on post and go to typing school." And we said, "We don't want to go to typing school." I said, "Here's the alternate. If you don't go to typing school, you're going to end up overseas in Korea for 21 months or whatever was left of it. If you go to typing school, we have an acute shortage of typing school." And they said, "And you can also play basketball." So we agreed to go to typing school. We get in there, and it couldn't have worked out better. The gal that was teaching was a Pittsburgh Pirate baseball fan. Oh, this was going to be beautiful. So we end up, in the rest of the room is all officers' wives. No other guys in the room. So she sits us right in the front two seats. So we're going along, and they're going. So finally, it comes the day of finals. You got to type 35 words, which was. So she says, "Here's what we're going to do." She says, "You get all set, and you got 2 minutes or whatever it is." And she said, "When I say go, you'll open to the page, do it, get your typing certificate. Ready, go." All over the room, and we're going. Then all of a sudden, "Oh, bullshit!" comes him. He said, John, what happened?" He said, "I started on the wrong line."
I had my fingers in the wrong place.
And she says, "All right, everybody, rip up your exam now, and we'll start all over again." So we got our 35 in, and I ended up being a receptionist for officers, where they had to go through me to get the city officer. And I had 3 S22s or S12s and all working for me, and I can't even type. And John, of all things, became librarian. But it ended up
The
in...
story about that librarian. It took 6 months to get all these TO&Es and all these upgraded and the whole thing. I had this librarian, Colonel White, remember?
Colonel White, nice
He
guy.
comes in, he said, "I looked at the TO&E and he says, I'm supposed to have a sergeant in here." I said, "Well, it's about time I got promoted." And he said, "The Army's not ready for that." He said, "I'll send this other sergeant in." Well, this other guy comes in, he says, "Man, we gotta change things here." And he pulled books out. I said, "The hell with this." So I go upstairs and I said, "Dad," I said, "what do they need up here?" And he said, "Well, the division artist got out of the Army." I said, "Good, tighten me up this deal. Easels and all that wood, all the paintings and all." So I take it over to this officer. I said, "Sign this." He said, "What is it?" I told him to sign it, which he did. So I get these all requisitioned, and I find an office, and I put on the door, "PFC John T. O'Brien, US 5127296, Division Artist." And I go in there. And the next thing, these officers are coming in, "Can you paint this?" I'm painting the lousiest pictures you've ever seen. And they're taking them to class like this, man, they had a coup. And finally, Colonel White comes up and he says, "Who the hell made you division artist?" I said, "I did." He says, "How much time you got left?" I said, 2 months. He said, "Well, then I suggest you conclude your Army career as division artist." But you gotta be a self-starter at times. You got more there, Rick?
Just a little more.
And then I'll finish it up.
While we were doing this here, of course, basketball comes into play. The Second Army was awarded the All Service Championship, and the winner to go to Fort McCord out in Seattle.
Fort Lewis, yeah.
It was McCord with the big long court. It was 10 feet longer.
Whatever.
And so they've got no team, but they've got a beautiful gymnasium. That's why they were awarded the tournament. So they come to us and said, "Can you put a team together?" We said, "Well, there's some guys here that play." So we put it together. We play our first game, and we lose it. We now have to win 6 consecutive games in order to win the championship. So we won 6 consecutive games. Played 3 games in 24 hours. The night before noontime, the night after. John made 93 of 95 foul shots in the tournament. And we end up, now, we are going to McCord Air Force Base. We're just PFCs, we're just getting into service. But they got to put us on special duty and put us in a barracks, feed us, and all of this kind of stuff. So we end up coming out, and I'll shorten it up. John was the MVP of that tournament again. John's the MVP of every tournament. And we play out here, and Aberdeen was kind of too close to Washington Post. They didn't want to do anything that was out of the ordinary, and there was a lot of officer training and stuff there. So they decided that, Washington decided that, why do you not have a team playing when you've got such players on your post? So then we put the team together, and the following year, John scored something in the neighborhood of 5,000 points in one season. But we're playing every night. We played the preliminary game to the NBA All-Star game in Madison Square Garden. We're up in the Boston Gardens, and we played all of these teams. And John was the leading scorer, military scorer in basketball for the entire world. So it just shows you what happens when little things develop for you. You know, John took some time and explained to you, and I'll close a little bit here, about what sports means to, what sports can mean to if it's done properly. All of you have heard of Stan Musial, the great hitter for the St. Louis Cardinals. Well, we're in Pittsburgh, and they were going to honor Musial in Denora, Pennsylvania. That's where his hometown is. And they asked John and myself to speak. And Eddie Stanky, who was the manager of the Cardinals at that time, was going to go with us. So we're driving after a Saturday game from Pittsburgh up to Denora. And I'm in the back seat with Musial. And he was, at this time, it's been 7 times National League leading hitter. And I said, Stan, tell me a little bit about yourself. I said, what bugs you? He said, what bugs me is when I'm at the plate and I don't concentrate. He said, I know this game, I know how everybody pitches me. He said, if I don't, I should always be able to concentrate. Here's a guy's up 700 times in the season, and he worried about the 7 times he didn't concentrate. And I said, when are you the toughest hitter? This is a story for baseball players. He said, I am the toughest hitter when I do not have a hit and I come to the plate for my last at bat. He said, if you look at my record, he says, I do very well there. And here's a guy, most people, they start out and don't succeed, and they drop it. And then it gets worse. But same thing with Robin Roberts, the great pitcher for the Phillies that went to 31 consecutive games. I asked him when he's the toughest pitcher. And he said, when I get 1 run behind. He said, I'm determined not to give up another run. That way my team can get back and win the game. These are 2 of the greats of all time. Simple philosophy, but it just works if you apply it. It doesn't out of sport just as well as in sport. So I'll wrap up mine there, and I'm going to give you one final story. I got 2.
He never could count.
We haven't talked about Father Lemieux, who of Seattle U, who was more than a story in himself. Back in those days, you know, we had a beat reporter for Seattle U and beat reporter for all the colleges and so forth. So we got, every day we're in the paper what's going on with the program. So we got a player named John Tresvant. And John was got him out of the military service up at Everett. He joined the team with Eddie Miles and Ernie Dunston, which is a very good team. So we, as we said earlier in the program, we used to do a road trip, a long road trip every Christmas over the holidays when school was out. So we're going east on a pretty good road trip. And John Tresvant's name was not on the travel squad. So the word was I would give the coach a number. 14, you take 14 guys, I don't care who they are, it's your business. That's all you take. So the phone rings over in my office. Well, no, I'm at home at night. The phone rings. Edward, Father President. Oh, yes, Father Lemieux. How are you doing? Oh, fine, fine. I was reading the paper today. He said, I noticed Mr. John Tresvant's name was not on our travel squad. I said, yes, Father. I said, he skipped 3 practices or something of that nature, and Coach Gazzetta decided not to take him. But this is a very important road trip. I said, I know it's a very important road trip, but it's up to Coach to pick out who he's going to take. If he's not taking Mr. Tresvant, he's not taking him. Well, that's the way to run your job. Doing your job. Very good. Hang the phone up 5 minutes later. Edward, Father President, have you been thinking about our decision that we were talking about? I said, what decision? He said, about Mr. Tresvant not being on this road trip. I said, Father, same thing applies. I said, I will never tell a coach who to take. That's a coach's business. I can't interfere there. Fine, that's the way to do your job. Very fine. About a half hour later, phone rings. Edward, Father President, I just happened to be talking to Coach Gazzetta. He has decided to take Mr. Tresvant on this road trip. Oh, I said, he has. Oh, that's good. I said, tell me the name he gave you that he's leaving home because he can only take 14. There's a big, long... And finally he says, all of Mr. Tresvant's expenses for this trip are to be billed directly to the president's office. He said, Edward, you know me. He says, I'm all for discipline, but not our first 5. That's the way he came down with it. So before John finishes, I'll give you my last story on John. I'm sitting up at Seattle U, and John calls me. He said, need a favor. I said, what's the favor? You got to give a speech for me. I said, oh, I could take care of that. No, he said, this one's a little different. He said, you have to go as me. I said, I have to go as you? Yeah. I said, why do I have to go as you? He said, because the speech is in Bremerton at the Elks or something like that, and it's on the King Dome, the new King Dome being put up and all of that. And he says, so you have to go as me. I said, well, I'll give it a run. So he says, you come down here, I'll give you an hour talk on what's happening. So I went down to his office, and he went over everything that was going on it. And I end up down at the ferry dock, and they pick me up on the ferry dock, take me over to Bremerton, come in at this thing. And so I get on there, and I finish dinner. They introduce me. I get up, and I give the talk that John wanted me to give. And I finish, and I go to sit down. The guy says, just a minute, John, we haven't seen you in a while. He said, we'd like to ask you questions. I go, uh-oh. So I agreed to it. Well, every question, due to his good teaching, every question they asked me, I had the answer for. So I finish it, and I come home. 3 days later, he calls me, and he's mad at me. He said, listen to this. Dear John, thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to come over and enlighten us on the new King Dome. Very enjoyable evening, and we thank you once again. I said, P.S. I've heard you give many speeches. That's the best one I've ever heard you give. And he's mad at me because it's all yours to wrap it up, John.
Well, yeah, that is true. That actually, that's one of the 70%. When you're playing baseball and you don't do something correctly, you expect the manager to really get all over you. But some strange things happen in those meetings with the manager and stuff like that. Maybe the second up there. We're still not doing very well. And we had a rally going, and it was the bottom of the 2nd inning, and we had runners on first base and second base, nobody out, and I'm the batter. Well, in those days we had signs, of course, come from the coach, but Haney had instituted a reversible sign. Now let's say you had an indicator, say it was touch the hat and the first thing after it, and this would be hit, take, bunt, steal. So if the coach, you look down at the coach, you go like that, that's nothing. But if he went like this, that was hit. because that was the first thing he touched after the hat. And then if he hit his belt, it was a takeoff and go. So anyway, I'm look down at the third base coach, and he goes like this and nothing. Then he hits the cap, and well, that's fun. Well, I missed a sign for some reason, and the pitch comes in, and I swing and foul it off. And in those days, you knew when you missed something. I go, oh God, I missed that. So I said, okay. So now I look down and I'm getting the signs, but I'm starting as this is the second sign. The coach knows I missed the first sign, so he's starting as it's the first sign. I'm one behind him the whole way. I've missed 6 signs. The count goes to 3-2. I lined into a triple play. I lined the ball to Eddie Matthews. He threw over to second base to Henry Aaron, was second baseman then. He came up as a second baseman, and over to Adcock, and I wiped out our only rally in the whole week. And when you do something...
Let me give you another one too.
We had trouble with signs, so Brett Haney said, I'm going to try new signs today and I want you to get them. He said, we're going to work off the scoreboard on numbers. So we go, numbers. He said, all right, we'll do this, we'll put a key in. The key will be the upper left shoulder here. He said, once you get the key, the sign is the next spot that he hits on the first one. He said, but if the count's 1-1, it's the second spot. If the count's 2-1, it's the third spot. If it counts 3-1, it's the fourth spot. If it goes to 3-2, it's the fifth spot. If you foul the pitch off, then you go back on 2 and stay on 2. So, Roberto Clementi's hitting. Looks down, he gets a sign, and Roberto goes, and he said, go back to the old signs, we just gave the new ones away.
Anyway, when you do something like I did, lined in a triple play after missing 6 signs, the first thing you do is look at the dugout and find out which end of it the manager's on, because you want to go to the other. So I go over there, and here's Haney. And I figure, now I'm going to get it. And Haney looked at me and said, kid, I find it hard to believe that you have a college education. That's all he said. That was the end of that. Sometimes things happen, and they're a backward compliment. As you know, Ed and I never knew what was going to happen. They made us pitchers. First guy I ever pitched against was Frank Robinson in the major leagues and all. And so Murtaugh comes to me one day and he said, how would you like to be the starting pitcher in the Polo Grounds on Sunday in the second game of the doubleheader against the Giants? I said, Dan, I'm not a pitcher. I've never pitched a couple innings in my whole life. He said, don't get overconfident. He said, I don't expect you to win. And he said, because I don't have a pitcher with any guts. He said, I want to put somebody out there with guts. And I said, should I consider that a compliment? And anyway, so we played the first game, and I'm coming out, and you warmed up behind home plate at the Polo Grounds. The place was so big. And Johnny Antonelli's pitching for the... So Antonelli's throwing the ball, and so I'm looking at him, so I throw the ball. And then he throws harder, and I throw, and I can throw harder than he can, so finally I'm throwing harder than him. And finally I stopped and I said, John, I said, how long do you warm up? And he said, well, I usually warm up about 13 minutes. And he said, then my arm pops. I said, well, my arm don't pop. He said, well, how do you feel? I said, okay. He said, got a curveball or anything? I said, yeah. He said, throw a couple of those. And he says, when you feel all right, go sit on the bench. I got the opposing pitcher telling me how to pitch. So anyway, the game starts. And by the grace of God, I get through 6 innings. I'm behind 4-3. And I threw the last pitch in the bottom of the 6th inning, and I fell flat on my face. My legs gave out. So I made believe I tripped. And I got up and I came back in the dugout, and Murtaugh come down and he says, thanks, you did what I want. He says, you're out of there. I said, what do you mean I'm out of there? I said, I'm behind. I'm going out there again. And Murtaugh quietly said, you know, I missed the paper this morning. He said, I didn't see where they made you the manager of this team. Losing pitcher, John O'Brien. I liked Milwaukee. When I was with Milwaukee in 1959, one of the things I really liked was every Monday morning there was a case of beer sitting on your front porch from the Milwaukee Brewers. And the other thing was we started out in Pittsburgh, as a matter of fact, and Spawn called me the night before from when the hotel had come down, and he had a roster of the Pirates, and he said, let's go through this. You were with the Pirates all those years, and tell me anything you might know about how to pitch some of these guys. And here's a guy with almost 300 wins that's still trying to learn things, and that's why he was such a great pitcher. But anyway, we win those games, and we go back to Milwaukee, and we got a day off, and Haney said, all right, tomorrow's first game. He said, everybody in the parking lot at 9 a.m. in uniform. Uniform. So Lapata, Stan Lapata and I had been traded from the Phillies over. So we're there, and we go out in the parking lot, and here's 30 cars with our names on it. That's our car to use during the year. Well, I had a little sports coupe, and Bob Buell had a station wagon, so we asked the guy if we could trade, and he didn't. He said the insurance is paid on them. And he says, here's what happens. He says, if you get 3,000 miles on the car, you bring it back, and I give you another one. So anyway, when I'd go on the road, Jean would go up to Dorchester, Wisconsin to visit her relatives and stuff like that. And we got 3,000 miles on the car. So I took it back to the dealership, and the guy says, okay, you want another station wagon? I said, yeah. So he pulls this one out. I said, let me ask you a question. I said, how the heck can you make any money doing it like this? He says, oh, it's simple. He said, when we sell these cars, we tell the people that's the one that Henry Aaron drove. and anyway, I'll finish it up in this way. Years later, I was asked to give a class at Seattle Pacific to graduate students and professors. And it was what the impact of sports has on your later life, how it leads to things that you do. And this professor got me there, and there were about 40 students and some professors, and a little lady in the bunch. And he went, God, he almost made me a saint, going through all the points at college and all this stuff. And so I did the class, and I left 10 minutes for questions. And the first question was from this man. He said, Mr. O'Brien, he said, what has luck got to do with what happens after you're through with sports and in your other careers? And I said, well, Branch Rickey at the Pirates used to say to us, luck is the residue of hard work. I said, if you work hard, I think you're going to get lucky. And this little woman, she says, Mr. O'Brien, I have a question. I said, yes. And she said, how high were the rims when you were playing? And I said, just the height they are now. And I know she didn't believe it. But just being with you folks has made both Ed and I feel like we're as high as the rims and maybe taller. Thank you very much.